Eurocentrism, a concept I'm not going to be explaining. Plenty of people out there on YouTube have done better jobs than me explaining it. Now, over time in EU4, European nations still kept their advantages throughout many updates. However, over time, more and more things were done to allow the other nations to at least conceptually catch up. And currently, in 2024, despite the game being called Europa Universalis, only a couple things actually remain a true European inherent advantage that other nations cannot overcome by just playing well. Namely, the trade nodes also go to Europe. The Western tech groups are still very strong, and the early institutions, namely Renaissance and printing press, have a much easier time spreading in Europe disproportionately. Now, I could try and balance this out and make it more fair and remove Eurocentrism, or I could take the patented lemon approach and just decide, you know what, let's just rig it for China instead. Welcome to China Universalis, or as the Chinese would say, Seppuku Ho Chi Minh Sengoku Jidai. Yeah, I can't speak Chinese. They still haven't figured out letters over there. They keep insisting on drawing pictures for words. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, now that I've offended all Chinese people away from the channel, time for the usual stuff. A like on the video would be appreciated, and a subscription would be amazing. 23k subs has been achieved, thank you very much for that. The distance against Timu is continuing to close, but he remains ahead. So any subscriptions to ensure our victory in the race to 25k are always very appreciated. Anyway, enough self-shitting. What have I done this time? Well, the main thing that took most of the work was actually a trade rework. This was the plan that you can see on screen now. To basically put China in the middle of the map, I have got most of the global trade to go to Beijing, or Canton, or to Lhasa, and that's because Lhasa feels bullied as a trade node, so I thought, you know what, let's give China an actual reason to liberate Tibet. A lot of the other trade nodes that were end nodes are now not end nodes, and this was quite a big project to actually implement into EU4, because I basically had to go to every single trade node, remove all of their outgoing trade nodes, and remod them, and make them all do their thing. This was significantly more painful than I expected. I would not recommend anyone to partake in this. As a part of the other issues is, well, EU4 trade nodes, when they go through certain points on the map, you also have to mod in what's called control points, so that the trade nodes go through the map in a way that isn't stupid, so they don't jut around in random places. I didn't do that. I didn't have the time to do that. If I did that, that would take me another week just going through all of that, doing it manually, because I could never get the nudge tool to work because I'm stupid. So we'd have a very, how do I communicate this? CCP government approved approach to the quality of the trade nodes in here. At some points, they actually work quite well. At some point, they're downright ridiculous. And at some other points, they're so stupidly over the top that it's actually kind of funny in terms of the actual pathing. But they all work quite well, to be honest. And the more surprising thing is, yet again, by rejigging all the world trade, I've made pretty much everyone poorer again. Like, unironically, this trade setup means that a lot of the Europeans still don't actually lose out that much. They can retain their trade and prevent it flowing upstream. But I think the big difference with this is as the game gets into the 1600s, there's a lot more consolidation. Nations are going to just start losing their trade power. My issue with comparing this systematically is, if I, say, just run a lobby until 1600 and look at the English income in 1600 on normal trade compared to, say, the 1600s of a China-centric trade system, it's not really a fair comparison because the lack of early income is going to prevent scaling, is going to prevent different developments. And then by 1600s, we also have a lot of RNG that's going to change how nations look. England might have higher income in a not Eurocentric setup, simply because England just does better because France is weaker, so it now has an easier game. It's very difficult to compare systematically in terms of how a nation will develop in that sense, so yeah. Well, I think enough talking, let's see how it looks in the actual world. And it's cursed, so I of course had to do a lot of testing, because obviously as I was adding the trade node routes in between themselves, I had to make sure that I wasn't adding them in any way that would cause crashes, any kind of loops, anything accidental that would occur in that way. But I managed to work through that. Anyway, enough coping by me. Let's load up into the Ming and see what's going on. So we of course still start with the current state of Ming affairs that hasn't gone away anywhere, but trade node wise, Beijing is now an end node, with trade coming in from Girin and Yumen and the rest of our land, as is Canton. Again, both of these are now end nodes, so yeah, China just pretty much starts with dominance over these two end nodes. Daviet has a decent chunk of it as well. It's a bit of a little budget Venice that you have going over here, so something that you may want to put an end to. With that said, the other end node is actually going to be Lhasa, which starts at around 3.2 ducats, but I find that one of the reasons for this is, of course, the default merchant assignments are quite bad for pretty much every single country under the sun. And that's because they are predefined on the old trade node system. They don't take into account all of these new trade nodes and their new, well, pathing. So I find it's more fair to not actually compare 1444 data, but to at least compare January 1445, as that's 2 months. It's usually enough for the AI to actually both reassign and wait for those merchants to arrive after that's happened. So if we now go into observer mode, we're going to see quite quickly actually that basically China's going to stop doing this little weird split with their trade. They're going to try and focus on Beijing, but in the process the AI is actually going to make significantly less money. Let me show you what I mean. So they focus on Beijing naturally, and Canton's value rapidly drops, and in fact they even lose half of its control to Deviate itself, which is not great because they're basically collecting and not a main node. It doesn't help them. And the other issue is you might be thinking, well, shouldn't this be a lot richer? And the answer is Europeans, again, just kind of hold on to their trade a lot of the time. You still have some very decent nodes in India. Lahore's kind of the big central one before it goes into Lhasa, for example, for the India trade. But like, it's not actually as big of a deal as it is. Basically, the issue is a lot of the Europeans have the trade power to maintain control. With that said, let's discuss a bit of the funny. More specifically, I think the most hilarious one I've seen as my best example is going to be the Cape of Good Hope to Zambezi trade node. See, what I thought that the AI would, well, not the AI, the automatic system would generate is something that just kind of goes along here, you know, through the land and enters Zambezi. That's the path. No, instead the Cape takes off from the Cape, goes through the coast, and then goes back into the Cape, goes through the Cape, and then goes on a journey. It goes on a journey through Brazil, goes along the trade wind, into Panama, through the Amazon Panama Canal, and then dips straight back down for a quick rendezvous stop at 00 in the world, goes underneath the Polynesian Triangle holdings of New Zealand, goes below Australia, and goes again across the Indian Ocean, across from Madagascar, to land in the Cape of Good Hope again. I don't know what's going on in this area. Well, okay, I do know Pretoria is going on in this area, that they have to go all the way around the world to avoid it. But then they go through the diamond districts again, all the way into the wasteland, to then turn back around and go straight back into Limpopo, go through this area, and then re-enter to finally end up in Zambezi. This is some amazing AI creation. Well, it's not really AI, it's more of the auto-designing routes. So basically, if you don't define a path, the game tries to generate a path for you. Some of them are pretty decent. For example, this Congo to Great Lakes path. Like, I'd rate this path pretty well. You know, that looks like it's almost hand done. And as is the Congo to the Zanzibar path. Like, all of these paths are automatically generated. Every single one is, even if it's a remade path that would exist before, because I deleted every single path and re-added all the ones I wanted manually. But then you also have things like the Cape of Good Hope, which is where you will also just see random trade nodes like going on in the North Sea. The North Sea, of course, being the new starting node, as is Chesapeake Bay. The Gulf of St. Lawrence, not Chesapeake Bay, that isn't a starting node. But yeah, this is now a starting node, as is Brazil. That is where trade begins, and as is the North Sea. So yeah, pretty much everyone is universally poorer. Genoa and Venice barely hold on. But I think the other interesting thing is how much it really changes the incentives. The Ottomans, for example, expansion-wise. Like, yeah, they can go into Ragusa to secure that node at least. But because their trade node goes to Constantinople, only goes to Aleppo, it's significantly easier for them to pseudo-end node it. And because of these expansion, it makes more sense for the Ottomans to almost push further into further nodes and go into Alexandria, because that trade isn't being just bullied by the Genoese and the Venetians. They actually can retain a lot of it. Although they have to be careful, because then they're now incentivized to go down into areas like Ethiopia. Tunis now also flows into Alexandria, as does Safi too, meaning that you actually have incentives to go that way as the Ottomans did, but failed, because they were also trying to get into the Morocco areas. So it's interesting, at least in that regard. Otherwise, yeah, there's still a lot of relative thought, I'd like to say, put into this. For example, Russia can still somewhat pseudo-end node into Kazan, but they also have options where Kiev is relatively easy to pseudo-end node if you hold Crimea, because it only goes to Crimea. So Russia can actually, if they don't want to go east too far, can go down into Kiev and pseudo-end node that. But then they're going to be having issues because Krakow also really, on Poland more specifically, wants to go into Kiev and Crimea to use Kiev as a pseudo-end node as well, as they'll be able to suck out trade from Novgorod in the process too. So yeah, there's a lot going on in that regard. And by adding things like so initially the North Sea didn't go to the Baltic here, but I did add a route for it. So it makes sense for someone like Sweden to go for Norway. Anyway, that's kind of the trade rework. The other things that, of course, we have to talk about are institutions. This was a bit easier to change. But if we tab back into the Ming again, the Renaissance has been renamed into the Reconstruction. This is because I went into Google Translate, I translated Renaissance into Chinese, then I took those two characters and translated those two characters back into English and got the Reconstruction. Because the Chinese do have a word for the Renaissance that's different to other words. But yeah, basically the rebirth of Rome doesn't kind of make sense for, a China-centric world. So they've gone for the Reconstruction period. It has a new spawn text and flavor texts. China remains the center of the world, blah blah blah, Chinese propaganda as you know and love. And the requirements for it are now that you must be in the North China, South China and Xinjiang regions. I also removed the institution spread of Renaissance for European nations. They get 0 of it passively. So Asian nations get the 0.5 on their capitals if their development is at least 20. So Asian nations will get the Reconstruction faster. But the +1 Reconstruction spread that you get for being in Italy now applies to the Chinese. So anyone in the Chinese regions of North China, South China, or Xinjiang are going to get massive Reconstruction spread passively. So the Europeans are going to be quite hindered with that because they're going to have to basically dev this. The other thing to, of course, talk about is the printing press. This was a bit easier to do, at least thematically, don't need to rename it, but yeah. You need to be in northern, southern China or Xinjiang. I also removed every single institution spread buffer printing press for having things like the Anglican religion embraced or being Protestant or whatever, because frankly that already made no sense. So yeah, the Europeans have no... It's kind of rigged against them. They can't really get printing press. They have to dev this one as well. And China just gets it, as they'll be able to spawn it and yeah, be able to spread in the north, southern China and Xinjiang regions in the same way that it had the buffs for Germany. So yeah, that's the other main ones. Thankfully, colonialism has no limitations. It can spawn in the Ming if you want to go that route, and so on and so forth. But yeah, obviously, ideally, I would go through every single nation's missions and rework them for this new Age of China objective, and probably turn down a whole bunch of other nations, like significantly down from tradability, so a lot more trade would actually flow upstream. Because at the moment, I'm not sure even China's necessarily richer compared to what it would be without it. I think it usually makes less money than production, so I think it is certainly wealthier than it normally is, but not as wealthy as I think it would be. And there we go, Lhasa has turned up to 6 ducats now. So yeah, so basically Tsang, one of the only 2 trade centers in the entire end node, the other one being, of course, down here in Nepal. Yeah, it's significantly wealthier than it really should be, making quite a bit more money from trade than it frankly deserves. But there you go, so Tibet now gets a lot of the love that it never really gets, being a proper end node. But that is all I have time for today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark and Suleiman.